distinguished members on the dais and distinguished delegates. This conference, as Vikas was just mentioning, is based on a theme which was arrived at after considerable discussion, which is e-governance for development, moving beyond electronic public services. Some may very appropriately ask, is this an appropriate theme? Where are the electronic public services? Why are we talking about moving beyond electronic public services when we haven't moved up to electronic public services? And I think that the answer to that question is extremely important, because in that lies the essence of the purpose of this conference, as well as the outcomes that we may want to seek in the course of the discussions. Today, there are different dimensions of use of ICT, and these different dimensions are actually very different worlds, in the sense that they normally have very little interaction or interface with each other. They tend to happen in isolation. If you take governance as an example, not only is governance itself, by which I mean the core processes of government, a little disjoint and separate from the processes of development, in which I would include government programs for development like education, health, and so on, as well as the developmental programs that are happening through civil society and outside of government-driven agendas. And the third is the economic growth outside of, again, government programs, purely in terms of market dynamics and enabling people across the country to get access to the economic opportunities that are increasingly becoming available within the country. That's a happy development, but sadly not easily accessible to all with equal measure, which is not so happy. So these three prongs of governance, of development, and of economic opportunity, or proliferation of, more precisely, proliferation of economic opportunity, by and large have been, separate from each other and have been happening on their own. Today we have, as far as the governance part of it is concerned, a national e-governance plan, which aims at creating some kind of a framework and a holistic approach to various e-governance initiatives that were happening across the country, both in states and in individual ministries, but again within their own silos. The silo of a particular department, or the silo of a particular wing, or the geographical silo of a state. But we all know that internet and the cyber world doesn't recognize any such borders at all. So the point is that this silo growth, under the NEGP, the idea was to look at it more holistically. But as it turns out, in the NEGP, several challenges were faced and certain approaches have been adopted. And the interesting thing is that these approaches also have a consequence of breaking down the separation of governance, of development, and of economic opportunity and proliferation of economic opportunity. And therefore, it is now increasingly clear that right from the inception, unless we plan for this convergence of these three non-intersecting worlds, we will have either problems later, or we would not have leveraged the power of these technologies in the most appropriate manner. And second thing is that it also turns out that it is far easier to carry out some of these implementations in the silos and in the vertical structures, because the institutional mechanisms and the people and the organizations are organized on those silos, so they know how to deal with their silo. So give them an idea and sooner or later somebody will pick it up and, probably learn the ropes and get it done. But what doesn't exist is how you function across silos. What are the mechanisms to function across these? How do you combine the objectives of governance and development? How do you combine the objectives of development and economic opportunity? Even the institutional mechanisms don't exist. I'm happy to see also that in the structure of the conference, there are sessions on how do you have stakeholder consultation. So this process of stakeholder consultation is extremely important because, again, these stakeholders come from different groups, are not necessarily aware of each other's priorities or compulsions. And therefore, any assumptions that you may make about some other stakeholders' requirements and priorities are quite liable to be flawed. So it is therefore essential that these mechanisms have to be built, and I am increasingly convinced from my own limited observations that this is the hardest part. The technology part and the technological building blocks are much harder and are much easier and quicker to put together, because at the end of the day technology is becoming increasingly commoditized. But the institutions, the people, the coming together, the collaborating not only in new ways but collaborating across domains which are not used to collaborating, that is a much harder ball game, because it involves people don't adapt immediately, and not only that, different people adapt at different pace, and you have to carry a whole lot of people along for this to happen. So let me just give a few examples, because all this may sound extremely abstract, but let's get right down to actual facts on the ground and how all these abstract principles are not only going to impact us in the future, but are impacting us here and now. And therefore, it is imperative that right now, even before we have matured in electronic public services, the time has come to also discuss about going beyond electronic public services and meshing the development agenda and the delivery of electronic public services.